What would you do if someone made you feel small? A little tortoise faces this question when a proud peacock enters his world. But this isn't a story of revenge, it's one of quiet kindness. In a quiet corner of the forest, there was a small shimmering pond that felt like a perfect secret. Frogs often hopped along its edges, dragonflies zipped over the water like gentle whispers, and the soft rustle of leaves played a song for anyone who stopped to listen. Among the reeds near its bank lived a tortoise. He moved slowly, his leathery shell showing signs of many peaceful years. He didn't rush through days. He didn't need to. For the tortoise, life was simple, calm, and full of little moments that made him happy. In the mornings, the tortoise enjoyed his favorite routine, nibbling on tender leaves from the low bushes near the water. He savored each bite, chewing slowly as sunlight dappled his pond. Sometimes, small ripples spread out across the surface when he dipped his head in for a refreshing drink. Other animals came and went, their visits short and fleeting, but the tortoise never minded. He liked his own company. Every so often, a robin stopped by to chatter about the latest flutterings in the forest. The tortoise would listen patiently, his kind smile barely visible under his wide jaw. It wasn't that the tortoise had much to say in return, but he still enjoyed being a quiet friend for anyone who needed one. The pond and its surroundings seemed to hum with harmony. Tall grasses waved gently in the breeze, lulling even the busiest bugs to pause. Near the far end of the water, a cluster of wildflowers bloomed in vivid yellows and purples, their petals glowing under the afternoon sun. One of the tortoise's favorite things was watching ripples break the surface in slow, lazy circles. To him, the world felt the most peaceful when everything moved naturally and at its own pace. The tortoise's kind nature was as much a part of his routine as his steady strolls along the pond's edge. When wind-tossed leaves cluttered the water, he would nudge them aside, making a clear path for the ducklings who sometimes practiced paddling. After a summer rain, when puddles turned muddy and thick, the tortoise carefully flattened safe spaces for smaller creatures to cross. These small acts never earned him loud thank yous or applause, but he didn't mind. He had no need to be the center of attention. If anything, that sort of thing sounded overwhelming. One evening, after a long stretch of warm sun that painted the water golden, the tortoise moved toward his usual favorite rock to rest. The air smelled fresh, carrying hints of mint from the grasses nearby. As he settled, an unusual sound drifted through the trees, a sort of clamor. It wasn't unpleasant at first, just louder than the usual hum of the forest. The tortoise tilted his head slightly, his large eyes blinking slowly. Then the sound came again, this time with more energy, like leaves crashing to the ground all at once. Something, or someone, was coming. Though the tortoise wasn't one to jump to conclusions, he couldn't help but feel a question blooming at the edges of his gentle thoughts. What, or who, might make such a bold entrance? The sound grew closer, a mix of rustling and faint, high-pitched chirps. The pond's usual calm seemed to pause. Even the dragonflies settled on cattails, their wings still. The tortoise took another small bite of a leaf, but his mind wandered. He had seen many animals come and go, yet this felt different. He straightened a little, his sturdy neck craning toward the trees without realizing it. There was nothing unkind about the tortoise's curiosity, but deep down, he wondered if his little peaceful corner of the world might soon be something else entirely. He felt the shapes of ripples under his feet, the water soft against his toes, and tried to remind himself that change didn't always have to be bad. Without knowing why, his heart seemed heavier than it had in a long time. Still, he waited quietly. That commotion, the voice, the movement, it carried an energy unfamiliar to the careful balance of the pond. It wasn't just loud, it was colorful, vivid in a way that almost made the air buzz. A faint breeze rippled the water, mirrors of clouds breaking apart as the smell of pollen and earth stirred all at once. The rich green fronds arching over the pond seemed to lean toward the noise, as though they too were eager to see what was on its way. For now all remained uncertain, leaving the tortoise caught between his usual calm and a curiosity he couldn't deny. Was it possible that the quiet comfort of his everyday life, his small joys, his helping hands, could hold its place beside whatever lay ahead? The tortoise closed his eyes, letting the serene sounds of his pond fill his mind. Still, in the distance, the clamor grew louder, steadily approaching. Little did the tortoise know, his peaceful days were about to shift in a big way. The peaceful rhythm of the tortoise's quiet pond broke, not slowly, but all at once. The once steady hum of life, with its rippling water and gentle breezes, was now interrupted by a burst of sound. From the canopy of trees came a rustling so loud it made the animals stop what they were doing. Birds turned their heads sharply, and even the dragonflies hovering over the pond seemed unsure whether to stay or flee. A voice, clear and brimming with confidence, rang out. Make way. Make way for the most dazzling sight you've ever seen. It was the peacock. His feathers burst into view, glinting in every color imaginable, vivid blues, shimmering greens, and tiny flecks of gold that caught the sunlight perfectly. With one grand sweep of his tail, he spread his train fully, so large and bright that it almost blocked out the trees behind him. The other animals gasped in unison. "Oh my," whispered a squirrel perched on a nearby branch. Even the frogs, who had lived by the pond for generations and were rarely impressed, stared with wide eyes. As the peacock strutted toward the edge of the pond, his head held high, he looked at the gathered crowd and spoke with ease. "Aren't my feathers the most beautiful you've ever seen?" His voice carried as though he fully expected the answer to be yes. The frogs nodded quickly, mumbling their agreement. While the birds chirped excitedly amongst themselves, the peacock spun in place, his long tail trailing behind like a glorious, colorful wave. "Take a good look," he said, letting the tip of his feathered train brush the ground. "This is how beauty moves." The tortoise, sitting on his favorite rock by the pond, watched quietly. This was not the first time another animal had passed through his little corner of the forest. But nothing like this had ever happened before. For years, the tortoise had shared his pond with creatures who valued its stillness, creatures who came to enjoy the quiet ripples or the shade. But the peacock was something entirely new. His voice, his feathers, every step he took, it all felt loud. It wasn't the kind of loudness that could be measured in sound alone. It was a loudness that demanded your attention. From where he sat, the tortoise noticed the other animals draw closer to the peacock, captivated by his display. They circled him, complimenting his colors, his height, and the way the sun seemed to make his feathers gleam. "How do you get them to shine so much?" asked a small mouse, his tone filled with awe. The peacock tilted his head elegantly and answered, "I was simply born this way." If the tortoise's feelings had a voice, they might have whispered, "Don't look too long. Don't think too much." He tried not to compare himself to the peacock, but it was difficult not to notice how every animal stood in admiration of him. The tortoise had never needed to prove himself before or seek attention. He was happy simply helping others, moving through his days one small task at a time. But now a quiet question crept into his thoughts. Could anyone even notice kindness when beauty shone so brightly? The tortoise shrank back a little, not from fear but from a sense that he no longer belonged at the center of their little world. For so long, the pond had been a place where animals came not to take but to share. He had always felt that no matter how slow or small he was, his efforts quietly added up. But now he wasn't sure. Perhaps scales and shells had no place alongside feathers so grand. The peacock's voice swept across the pond again. "I think this spot will do nicely." He strutted to the water's edge, his reflection perfectly framed in the still surface below. He leaned closer and stared at himself, smiling. "Yes, this will suit me. Perhaps I'll stay." His words fell into the water as a ripple spread in soft circles. None of the animals seemed bothered by the bold announcement. They were too busy chattering about how lucky they were to see him. "It's not every day you get to call a peacock neighbor," exclaimed a rabbit. The tortoise shifted quietly and adjusted his place on the rock. His favorite spot, the one protected by trailing leaves, now felt too far removed from where everyone stood. He watched the other animals following the peacock eagerly, their movements quick and excited, as if they were trying to catch every moment he gave them. No one noticed the tortoise, sitting still and silent as he always had. What confused the tortoise most was how quickly things had changed. He hadn't realized how easily attention could shift, how fast the quiet kindnesses he worked so hard to show could seem invisible in comparison to something as bold as pride. Was the world truly like this? For a moment, he wondered if he should find some way to make himself seen too, a way to fill the same space the peacock now occupied. But then, another thought came to him, softer but steady. Maybe it wasn't about filling space at all. He watched as the peacock perched on a nearby stone, addressing the animals below like a performer on stage. Every feather was perfectly arranged, every movement deliberate. The tortoise found himself wondering why the peacock needed such constant attention. The sun lowered toward the trees, casting long shadows across the pond. The peacock, still speaking, laughed and shared the story of how he'd once won a forest-wide competition for most magnificent bird. The animals clapped their paws and wings. The tortoise listened quietly, his expression calm. He wasn't upset, but he did feel something tugging at the edges of his heart, a small question that hadn't found its answer. As the crowd around the peacock grew noisier, the tortoise kept to himself. He thought of his usual days at the pond, when he would help the frogs lift heavy leaves or carry berries to those too small to reach them. These actions had never been grand, but they had always felt good. Now, the memory of them felt smaller, somehow, as though they hadn't happened at all. The forest grew quieter with the evening, though the chatter around the peacock continued in soft waves. The tortoise lowered himself slowly into the cool pond water, giving the scene one last glance before resting. It wasn't sadness or anger he felt, but a sense of wondering. Did his quiet life still hold value in a place so full of color and sound? The tortoise was not one to rush to answers. He let the water lap gently around him as the stars began to appear above. He thought about what it meant to feel small, to feel like you didn't matter. But he also wondered if there might be a way for small things to shine, just as quietly as the moon glows beside the night. The pond had never felt like a place for questions before now, but the tortoise, even as he closed his eyes, could not help but feel the weight of one. The world had changed with the peacock's arrival. A small, kind life now seemed almost invisible, and yet, as he rested, sinking deeper into the water's gentle hush, part of him wondered if there was something beautiful in being quiet and kind too. The tortoise began to wonder if there was any value in being quiet and kind. Each morning at the pond began the same way. The tortoise would wake with the soft rustling of reeds and the faint light peeking through the treetops. And each morning, without really meaning to, his thoughts wandered to the peacock. The tortoise couldn't quite explain what he felt. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, but a sense that something had shifted, like when a strong wind reshapes the surface of the water. The pond was still a comforting place, yet it felt less like his. The peacock's arrival brought a constant flurry of activity. Every day was filled with noise, his bold calls echoing through the trees, animals gathering to hear his stories or marvel at his feathers. "Have you ever seen such brilliance?" he'd say, unfolding his shimmering train, letting the sunlight dance off of it. It was true. The peacock's feathers were beautiful. Even the dragonflies, who rarely stopped to admire anything, hovered near him as if drawn by some invisible pull. The tortoise watched from his usual spot tucked beneath the shade of a low branch. He was used to being small, to moving quietly, almost unnoticed. But now it felt different. It felt as if his stillness, his kindness, had been completely forgotten. The tortoise didn't blame the animals for being drawn to the peacock. The colors, the stories, the energy. It was exciting. But somewhere in that excitement, the tortoise realized he had become invisible. He tried to focus on his usual routines, the small things that brought him joy. While the peacock drew a crowd near the water's edge, the tortoise worked quietly nearby. When a family of frogs struggled to move a tangle of leaves clogging their favorite swimming spot, the tortoise nudged the leaves aside with his strong shell. The frogs blinked up at him with big eyes, thankful but quickly darting off toward the dazzling peacock's show. The tortoise smiled softly. He wasn't expecting anything in return. It wasn't his way, but there was still a hollow feeling that lingered as he watched them leave. Later that day, he noticed some tiny ants gathering crumbs along the shore. A sudden breeze blew through the grass, scattering the crumbs into the water. Without hesitation, the tortoise bent low to scoop some fresh leaves from the pond's edge, placing them carefully on the ground. The ants, in their careful line, climbed onto the leaves one by one. They didn't say anything, but the tortoise watched as they returned to work, using what he'd given them. It was small, yes, but it mattered, didn't it? By contrast, the peacock's focus seemed to rest entirely on being noticed. "It's not every day you see beauty like mine," he'd say, fluttering his feathers dramatically. Groups of animals laughed and clapped, some even trying to mimic his strut. The tortoise listened from his spot near the pond but felt no urge to join. He wasn't sure he belonged in moments like that. Every so often, he heard the peacock's remarks brushing past him, unintentional perhaps, but cutting nonetheless. "Not everyone is meant to stand out, you know. the peacock had said one afternoon, his tail fanning out like a brilliant sunrise. The tortoise lowered his head, pretending not to hear, but the words rested uncomfortably in his mind. That night, as the moon cast a soft glow over the water, the tortoise lay awake on his favorite smooth stone. Normally, the quiet hum of the pond lulled him into a restful sleep, but tonight it offered no comfort. He kept replaying the peacock's words in his mind. Was it true? Did standing out matter more than helping, more than being kind? He thought back to the frogs, the ants, the little animals who needed him in small ways. Maybe those things weren't dazzling. Maybe they didn't draw a crowd. But without them, the pond wouldn't be the same, would it? Still, the doubt lingered. The next morning, as the sky turned a pale lavender, the tortoise watched the peacock again. He watched the way animals gathered, the way they admired him, and he wondered, was a simple, quiet life enough? As the peacock began another tale recounting how he'd once been crowned the star of the meadow, the tortoise felt smaller than ever. With the world's attention so focused on feathers, who would notice a humble shell? But that question wouldn't go unanswered for long. The tortoise reminded himself of something he had always known. Kindness didn't need attention to matter. There was no applause when he lifted a beetle to safety or nudged berries closer for a shy rabbit. There were no stories told about the time he pushed a floating branch aside to save baby ducks from drifting too far. But each of those moments felt real, and that had always been enough before. He told himself it should still be enough now. The morning was bright and still, the kind where sunlight gently touches the treetops before spilling onto the forest floor. The tortoise, slowly making his way along the pond's edge, carried his usual calm, though the air felt unusually warm. Across the water, the peacock was in the middle of one of his daily performances. As always, animals had gathered in a small crowd, marveling as the peacock fanned out his extravagant tail feathers, each one glistening light like treasure in the sunlight. "Behold," the peacock called, spinning gracefully so the light caught every color. "Have you ever seen anything more magnificent?" The animals clapped their paws and flapped their wings in agreement. "Truly, the brightest bird in the whole forest," chirped a robin, earning an approving nod from the peacock. With his chest puffed out and his head held high, he basked in their compliments, his pride filling the air around him like an invisible cloud. The tortoise paused for a moment. From where he stood, half hidden by the reeds, he could hear the cheerful chatter and the peacock's booming voice. It didn't bother him as much anymore. Instead of feeling invisible in the shadow of the peacock's grandeur, the tortoise had decided long ago to focus on his quiet tasks. Life went on, even with a peacock in their midst, but as the day grew hotter, something unexpected happened. The peacock, known for his elegant strut, decided to take his usual show deeper into the nearby forest. "Time for a new audience," he declared, his feathers shimmering behind him. The smaller animals followed, hoping to glimpse his next performance. As they moved farther from the pond, the trees grew thicker and the air became cooler. The ground, covered in dry leaves and twisted vines, made walking tricky. "Careful now," the peacock said haughtily, avoiding a branch that had fallen in his path. But his eyes, always scanning for admiration, weren't watching the ground as closely as his words suggested. As he stepped forward after another graceful turn, his dazzling tail feathers brushed against a low-hanging thicket of brambles. He didn't notice at first, too caught up in his performance, but when the thorns snagged his feathers, they stopped him in his tracks. He tugged, turning sharply, but the more he struggled, the more the brambles tightened their hold. "My feathers!" the peacock cried, twisting and pulling. Bits of golden fluff began catching on the sharp thorns, and his grand tail, his pride and joy, became trapped. His voice rose, louder than usual. "Help! Someone help me! My feathers are stuck!" The animals froze, startled by the sudden panic in the peacock's voice. They had always seen him as confident, untouchable, the very picture of perfection. But now, he seemed almost small in his struggle, half turned and flapping his wings desperately. The robin fluttered nervously nearby but hesitated, unsure of how to help without causing more damage. A squirrel, watching from a low branch, considered climbing down before stopping. "What if I make it worse?" the squirrel whispered. As more animals gathered, but did nothing, the peacock grew louder, his calls tinged with frustration. "Don't just stand there," he pleaded. "I need help." The brambles held firm, and every movement only seemed to make things worse. His once perfect feathers were beginning to bend, some even tearing slightly. For the first time, the peacock looked frightened. It was in this moment of quiet hesitation that the tortoise appeared. Unlike the rest of the animals, who watched from a safe distance, the tortoise moved steadily toward the scene, his shell reflecting soft light under the trees. He didn't make a sound, didn't announce himself, but quietly approached until he was close enough to hear the peacock muttering, "This can't be happening. Not to me." "Are you hurt?" The tortoise asked gently, his voice steady but calm. The peacock, caught somewhere between his pride and his growing panic, blinked and looked down at the tortoise. "Hurt?" he sniffed. "No, of course not. But my feathers. Look at my feathers. They're ruined, and I can't get free. Do you know how important they are?" The tortoise didn't reply immediately. Instead, he took a closer step, inspecting the tangled mess of thorns and feathers. The peacock, despite his panic, hesitated, unsure what to make of the tortoise standing there so quietly. "Well," the peacock snapped after a moment, "are you going to help, or just stare?" Without saying much, the tortoise got to work. Using his strong shell, he leaned into the brambles carefully, creating enough space to loosen the thorny vines. The peacock stilled, watching as the tortoise nudged the thorns gently with his head and legs, doing no more than needed to free each feather. It was slow, steady work none of the smaller animals could have managed on their own. For every thorn that snagged, the tortoise found a way to release it without tearing more feathers. His movements were deliberate, almost methodical, and even the peacock couldn't help but notice how much care went into every moment. Around them, the forest grew quiet. The robin, the squirrel, and the other animals watched silently, their attention now shifted away from the peacock's vibrant feathers to the tortoise's steady efforts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last thorn fell away, and the peacock stepped back, his tail feathers trembling but free. "There," the tortoise said, simply stepping back. The peacock turned, glancing over his feathers before looking down at the tortoise. For a long moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Eventually, he managed, "You saved them." "It's just what needed to be done," the tortoise said, his tone so calm it might have been mistaken for indifference. But there was no judgment in his words, just honesty. "Your feathers are important to you. I could see that." The peacock stared, his magnificent tail now trailing behind him, a few feathers worse for wear but intact. The other animals remained quiet, watching the peacock carefully. His usual confident posture faltered slightly. "Well, thank you," he said finally. It came out softer than his usual tone, almost quiet. "I didn't think you would. I didn't expect... You didn't think I could help?" The tortoise finished for him, his voice light, not unkind. The peacock hesitated but nodded. For the first time, the peacock saw the tortoise in a new light. Everything he had overlooked, the tortoise's strength, his patience, his quiet nature, suddenly felt significant. The tortoise, without shining brightly or drawing attention, had saved him in a way no one else could. The forest was calm again, but the echoes of the peacock's cry still hung faintly in the air. He had made his way back to the pond slowly, his grand feathers trailing behind him, some ruffled or slightly bent from the ordeal. The animals who had gathered to watch his rescue had dispersed, leaving him alone with his thoughts for once. He didn't strut this time. He didn't lift his head quite as high either. Instead, he kept glancing back over his tail, his sharp eyes scanning the delicate plumage. The tortoise had already returned to his usual spot by the water's edge. He didn't look as though anything unusual had happened. His small movements were slow and deliberate, as they always were. He didn't seem to expect anything from the peacock. No recognition, no lingering thanks. For the tortoise, it was another moment of helping, even if the one helped had been the most unlikely of all. From where he stood, the peacock paused, unsure of what to do next. Normally, he would call out to the others or announce himself with a sweep of his feathers. But the words didn't come. He thought about how easily the other animals had gathered to watch him boast and display. Yet not one had stepped forward when he truly needed them. His feathers had become tangled, thorned, and vulnerable, and in that moment, the pride he wore so boldly had not brought him help. It had only made the animals hesitate. He turned his head toward the tortoise, who was quietly nudging small branches out of the water. No one else seemed to notice what the tortoise did. The peacock let out a faint sigh, his wings resting at his sides. For the first time, he realized how much the tortoise's steady presence had gone unseen, not only by him but by everyone. Walking carefully along the edge of the pond, the peacock's steps were slower now. Without the usual fanfare of his stride, the sound faded into the soft lapping of water and the rustling of nearby reeds. He stopped near the tortoise but didn't speak right away. His earlier words, loud and certain, felt unfit for the moment. The tortoise, sensing his presence, lifted his head. "Can I help you, Peacock?" asked the tortoise simply, as if the earlier chaos hadn't happened at all. For a moment, the peacock didn't answer. His gaze shifted toward the pond surface, watching the faint ripples that trailed from the tortoise's movements. He found himself wondering how many times the tortoise had worked quietly, unseen, while he had distracted everyone with his feathers. "You already did," the peacock said softly, his tone carrying none of its usual sharpness. "Back there." The tortoise tilted his head slightly, as if thinking. "Oh, that," he replied after a pause. "It wasn't much." The peacock's wings twitched at the words. "It was. You saved my feathers. My pride." There was a hesitation in his voice, as if the word itself felt heavier now than it once had. The tortoise didn't respond right away. Instead, he returned to clearing the small branches from the water, his movements unhurried but purposeful. The peacock watched, unsure whether he should stay or walk away. When the tortoise finally spoke, he did so without looking up. "Sometimes what matters to you doesn't matter to others," he said. "But if it matters to you, it's worth helping with." The peacock blinked at the simplicity of it. There were no grand lessons or big speeches, just a soft recital of a truth the tortoise seemed to live by every day. He thought back to the brambles, to how the tortoise had worked so steadily and carefully to free him without damaging his precious tail. The peacock realized he had taken that effort for granted in the moment. His thoughts trailed back to his usual performances at the pond. Loudness, brightness, beauty. Those had been his tools, his way of walking through life. But they hadn't been enough to untangle him from trouble. That thought settled uneasily inside him like a ripple spreading across still water. The animals had waited and watched but hadn't stepped forward. Not until the tortoise did. The peacock glanced away, the sharp edge of his usual confidence slipping further. "Why did you stop to help me?" he blurted out before realizing he had spoken. The tortoise looked up, curious. "Why wouldn't I?" he asked back, his tone even. "You needed it." "You don't dislike me?" the peacock said, his feathers low. "After all my noise, all my showing off?" The tortoise shook his head gently. "It's just who you are," he answered. "I don't mind noise. I mind things that hurt the pond. You don't." For the first time, the peacock didn't know how to carry the conversation forward. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it left space for thoughts that felt heavier than usual. He remembered his boasts, his need for admiration. He also remembered the hesitation he'd seen on the faces of the animals when he had called out for help. Their admiration had limits, it seemed. But the tortoise, a creature who hadn't asked for attention, had acted without hesitation. It wasn't from duty or show. It was simply because the peacock had been in need. "Thank you," the peacock said at last. The words weren't loud. They weren't for a crowd. They barely made their way across the space between him and the tortoise, but they carried a weight the peacock rarely allowed himself to share. The tortoise only nodded. Gratitude wasn't something he expected or demanded. He went back to nudging away the small branches, his shell catching the light in faint, glinting patches. But for the peacock, that moment felt heavier than so many others. His feathers remained beautiful, but for the first time, their magnificence didn't feel as important as the quiet, steady presence beside him. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched across the pond, the peacock felt his usual pride flickering like an uncertain flame. He still admired his tail, and he still delighted in the way it could catch the sunlight. But maybe that wasn't all there was. He glanced toward the tortoise again and saw something he had overlooked for so long. Not just strength, but a deep and quiet confidence that needed no stage. The pond felt a little quieter, but also a little kinder. The pond, once filled with the hum of bustling animals seeking the peacock's attention, now carried a softer rhythm. Life had adjusted. The peacock still fanned his brilliant feathers now and then, but there was something new in the way he moved. His steps, while still poised, had slowed just slightly, and his voice no longer rang with unbridled self-assurance. Instead of beginning each day with declarations of his beauty, he now spent quiet moments at the water's edge, watching the sunlight dance on the still surface. He still liked being admired, of course, but his shows had grown shorter and less boastful. The tortoise, meanwhile, carried on as he always had, steady and kind. In the early mornings, before the other animals stirred, he took his time cleaning the pond. He nudged stray branches from the water and pushed scattered leaves to the shore. When a family of frogs hopped by, their little ones following behind them like wobbly grains of rice, the tortoise dipped his head in greeting. The smallest frog, barely bigger than the tip of a leaf, waved back before scurrying after her brothers. These were the moments that made the tortoise feel whole, not applause, but the quiet knowledge that his efforts made life a little easier for those around him. The animals, who once crowded around the peacock, had begun noticing more of the smaller things, too. This wasn't because the peacock had stopped dazzling them, but because something about the dynamic in the pond had shifted. They began to realize that for all the peacock's grandeur, the steady work of others filled their lives in quieter ways. A robin perched one afternoon on a low-hanging branch, watching as the tortoise spent time helping a beetle cross a tricky patch of ground. She tilted her head in thought. "Do you always help such small creatures?" she asked. The tortoise looked up, the shadow of a smile crossing his face. "Why shouldn't I?" he replied. "I'm small too, in my own way." Word of these small acts began to ripple through the pond, just as the peacock's beauty once had. The animals didn't gain loud new habits. They didn't rush to praise the tortoise, but there was a new kind of respect in the way they looked at him, spoken through softer actions. A rabbit paused to chew a leafy stem near him one evening, her ears tilted to acknowledge his steady presence. A family of ducks quacked their thanks without hesitation when he cleared a path for their waddling team. It wasn't loud recognition, but it was there, a quieter appreciation that wrapped itself around the pond like a gentle current. Meanwhile, the peacock and the tortoise had begun to interact in small ways. It started the day after the bramble incident, when the peacock had returned to the pond feeling both grateful and unsure of himself. He had watched the tortoise work from a distance, listening as the rippling water kept time with his movements. At first, he wasn't sure how to approach the tortoise. He hadn't had many moments where he wasn't front and center of a conversation. Eventually, though, he wandered closer with unsure strides and a faint clearing of his throat. "You're busy again, I see," the peacock had said casually, though his voice was missing its usual luster. The tortoise looked up, his eyes calm as ever. "There's always something to do," he said quietly, tilting his head toward a pile of weeds he'd been gathering. The peacock watched him for a moment, frowning slightly as if he wanted to say more but didn't know how. "You never get tired of it? Working, I mean?" The tortoise took his time with his answer. "Not really," he said, returning his attention to the weeds. "It's what I can offer. That's enough for me." From there, the exchanges grew bit by bit. Some days, the peacock stood nearby, silently watching as the tortoise worked or helped others. On a warmer afternoon, the peacock remarked, almost offhandedly, that he'd noticed fewer branches cluttering the pond water lately, and that it seemed clearer than before. "I guess that's your doing," he said, his tone neutral, but tinged with something the tortoise couldn't quite place. The tortoise nodded. "It's what needs doing." At first, these moments didn't seem significant to the other animals. The peacock was still the peacock, vivid, lively, and beautifully feathered, but quieter now, reflective in ways they hadn't expected. What stunned them more was how the tortoise carried on the same way he always had, unaffected by the peacock's attention. Whether he worked beside a bright, shimmering presence or alone in the soft shade, the tortoise remained the same. The pond, once solely a stage for dazzling displays, returned to balance. The peacock's shows still had their place, but they no longer consumed the day. Some mornings, if you looked closely, you might have seen the peacock helping the smaller birds arrange petals into their nests. Though he did so awkwardly, fluffing his wings after each attempt, the gesture was there. Other times, you might have spotted him walking beside the tortoise. Both quiet in their shared space, the peacock occasionally asking questions about the little things the tortoise tended to. And then, one golden evening, something entirely new happened. The peacock, perched on a low rock, called out, not to brag about his feathers, but to speak of the tortoise. "Did everyone see how clear the stream is today? That's because of him," he announced, his gaze landing on the tortoise. The crowd of animals blinked, surprised. The tortoise, on the other hand, chuckled softly and shook his head but said nothing. It wasn't in his nature to seek attention, but the moment brought a quiet pride to his heart. He felt no need to puff his chest or take a bow. He simply returned to the work he loved, knowing that his kindness didn't need applause to matter. In that moment, kindness and pride stood beside each other, not battling, but balanced. Harmony began to return to the pond. The animals, now seeing the value in both quiet acts and grand moments, started finding ways to mirror that balance themselves. A squirrel helped an aging rabbit carry an acorn back to her burrow. The ducks began picking stray weeds from the water as they swam. Even the frogs, who often hopped noisily, paused to notice the tortoise's steady care. The pond itself seemed lighter, as though it, too, had found a way to blend the bright with the calm. In the evenings, the tortoise rested in his usual spot by the water, content in knowing that his actions, though simple, had made a difference. The peacock perched nearby these days, not as an interruption, but as a companion. He still radiated color and pride, but now it seemed quieter, softer, as though it sat alongside something new. And so, the tortoise continued his quiet, kind life, knowing that his actions spoke louder than words. What does this story teach us about true strength? Let's take a moment to think back to the tortoise and the peacock and all they've shown us. The tortoise, humble and quiet, found his strength in kindness. He didn't seek attention or applause, but still, his actions made the pond better for everyone around him. The peacock, bold and proud, loved to shine and be noticed, but when he found himself in trouble, it wasn't his beautiful feathers that saved him. It was the tortoise with his patient and steady kindness who came to his side. Through their story, we learn that kindness has a power of its own, even if it doesn't always stand out. Being kind means noticing the small ways you can help, like the tortoise clearing paths and sharing his time with those who needed it. And just as importantly, the peacock learned something too. He realized that being admired is nice, but it's not what truly matters. What matters is the way we care for and help each other, even when no one is watching. Now, let's pause to think about all the ways we can show kindness in our own lives. Maybe it's helping a friend when they were feeling upset, or sharing with someone who doesn't have as much. It doesn't have to be a big act. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like a smile or a kind word, can make someone's day brighter. Can you remember a time when you did something kind? Or maybe when someone was kind to you? How did it feel? The peacock helped us see another important lesson: humility. Humility means knowing it's okay not to always be the center of attention. Even the peacock, with his bright and beautiful feathers, realized that asking for help doesn't make you weak. It's brave to say, "I need help," and even braver to appreciate the help when it comes. When the peacock thanked the tortoise, it was a small action, but it showed us that it's never too late to notice the value in others. Let's think about what the tortoise showed us too, that being yourself is enough. The tortoise didn't try to be loud or flashy or bigger than life. He stayed true to who he was even when it felt like no one noticed. He didn't give up on being kind even when others overlooked him. And in the end, it was this quiet strength, this belief in doing what's right, that made all the difference. Sometimes it feels like we have to do big, exciting things to matter. The peacock thought his feathers were what made him special, and he wanted everyone to see them. But the tortoise reminds us that it's not about being the brightest or the loudest. It's about being steady, caring, and true to yourself. It's about knowing that small acts of kindness, helping someone, keeping your promises, or just being a good friend are more important than being admired. That's the kind of strength that lasts. Now let's take a deep breath together and think about how we can bring kindness into tomorrow. Imagine what your day could look like if, just like the tortoise, you found one small way to help someone. It could be holding the door for someone, saying thank you, or sharing a toy with a sibling or a friend. These little acts can seem ordinary, but they're part of what makes the world a nicer place. How would it feel to know that in your own quiet way, you made someone's day just a little brighter? And let's not forget about the lesson the peacock leaves with us. He teaches us how to grow. It's okay to want to shine, to be noticed. It's natural to be proud of who we are. But he also shows us how important it is to be humble and to appreciate others. Next time you're around someone different from you, ask yourself what you might learn from them. Could they help you see something in a new way, just like the tortoise did for the peacock? Learning to value kindness, humility, and self-acceptance isn't always easy, but it's worth it. Life is full of moments where we have to choose who we will be. Someone who takes time to notice others, shares little acts of kindness, and stays true to ourselves, or someone who only seeks the admiration of others without thinking of what's truly meaningful. This story reminds us that the quiet strength of kindness will always shine the brightest. As you think about these lessons, let them settle in your heart like the calm ripples of the pond after the rain. Throughout the story, the tortoise didn't change who he was to fit in. He didn't raise his voice just to be noticed or try to outshine the peacock. Instead, he showed us the beauty of staying true to yourself, even when it feels like no one is watching. What small things can you do to show that kind of strength tomorrow? Let's take another deep breath. As we breathe in, let's imagine all the kindness in the world. Every small, quiet act that helps someone else. And as we breathe out, let's send a bit of kindness back out into the world. Ready for tomorrow. Kindness doesn't need to be big or loud to be strong. It's there in the way we care, the way we notice what others need, and the way we choose to be true to ourselves. What this story teaches us in the softest and simplest way is that kindness has a beauty no one can take away. It's not about who sees it or who claps for it. It's about the difference it makes, whether it's noticed or not. And while the peacock's feathers are lovely, we learn that what really matters, what really lasts, is the kindness we give and the humility we carry. Good night, sleep tight, and remember, kindness always shines brightest. Kindness is the quiet strength that changes the world. It may not be loud or easy to see, but it's always there, making things better for everyone it touches. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about one kind thing you can do tomorrow. Maybe it's helping a friend, sharing something you love, or simply giving someone a big smile. Kindness isn't about being the biggest or brightest, it's about how it makes others feel. And just like the tortoise, your kindness can make a difference. Good night, and remember, the world always needs your kindness. Sleep tight and sweet dreams.